All right, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I would like to go ahead and introduce our presenter, Olivia Cook, who is one of our housing development specialists. Olivia, take it away.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so today I will be presenting on how to submit an application with the Division of Housing for GAP funding. So to go over what we'll be talking about today, I'm going to start with our mission, talk about an overview of DOH funding, go through how to submit an application and then the instructions and requirements, and then also include some best practice tips for your application, but those will be kind of scattered throughout the presentation, so keep an ear out. So the mission for Division of Housing, as I'm sure most of you know, is that we, or Division of Housing, partners with local communities to create housing opportunities for Coloradans who face the greatest challenges to accessing affordable, safe, and secure homes. So the different ways that Division of Housing can help support that is by helping fund different projects and activities. So if someone is looking at a housing development or a project to try to create or preserve affordable housing, Division of Housing can help in the following ways. So if the project is for rental or home ownership, multifamily or single family, a low barrier shelter, permanent supportive housing, or if there's new construction and acquisition with or without rehabilitation. So on that bullet point, Division of Housing can help with funds if, again, if it's new construction, or if there's acquisition of a property, or maybe trying to preserve an existing building. Whether there is or is not rehabilitation, we might be able to provide some GAP funds. And then I know quite a few people are interested in the new funding that was just approved in the 2022 legislative session. So just kind of an FYI, that funding, we're really excited about it. We're still trying to figure out exactly how that is going to all shake out, kind of the details of the program, and then also the details of how to apply. So for this particular webinar, I'll be focusing on what I'll call our regular GAP funding applications. And those are applications for GAP funds for the activities that we just talked about. Those are the applications that have been around for years. We accept applications on the 1st of every month. So that will show you how to get into our online application portal like Neighborly. But for some of these new applications and new funding sources, there might be other ways to apply. And if that's the case, the instructions will be released through a NOFA, or Notice of Funding Availability. And I'll show you where you can find that on our website later. But just kind of throwing it out there that this particular webinar is for our regular GAP funding applications, and these new programs might have some nuances or different ways to apply. So in general, if you are thinking about a housing development, Division of Housing, like I said, can be a GAP funder for those. So Division of Housing can't start reviewing an application until 75% of funding is committed. Typically what that looks like is a bank loan, or maybe quite a few other different grants are being put into the project. And once all of that is squared away, we can start reviewing the application and underwriting it. And the way that the GAP funding subsidy works is there's not a set number that would be your cap of what you can apply for. So for example, there isn't a maximum number, say $5 million ask that someone can submit for. It really depends on the number of units. So for rentals in the urban or metro areas and homeownership units, that subsidy amount that DOH can help with as a GAP funder is $25,000 per unit. In more rural areas, that's $35,000 per unit. And then for permanent supportive housing, it's $45,000 per unit. And just a note on that too, those are kind of our baselines and where we like to start when we look at these projects. But every project is very unique and might have different locations or considerations. So be sure that you reach out to your specific housing development specialist to talk through that, because there's potential that there's a little bit of flexibility, but these are kind of where we like to have our parameters set. And then to define urban and rural, counties with populations of 180,000 people or more are considered urban, and counties with a population of less than 180,000 people are considered rural. In addition to that, there are also area median income recommendations, or AMI. So what that means is, going back to our mission statement, Division of Housing would like to fund projects then that can preserve affordable housing. And that is based on the AMI levels for the different units, so the rent levels. And I'll talk a little bit more about where you can find that information later on. But generally, again, the parameters for that are for rental units in urban and metro areas, Division of Housing can fund units up to 60% AMI, and for rural rental, that would be 60 to 80% AMI. And then for home ownership for the urban areas, up to 80% AMI, and then rural up to 120% AMI. But again, every project is very unique and different, and the project might change based on location, housing type, project size, number of units, all of that. So definitely be sure to reach out to your housing development specialist to talk more about your specific project, but know that this is kind of where we like to land. And then a little tip here too, especially if you are doing an urban rental project, Division of Housing encourages applicants to incorporate a minimum of 5% of units at 30% AMI. And then of course, always encourage more, but keep that in mind when you're starting to look at your unit mix. So I've talked a lot about talking to your housing development specialist, or DEVO, if you have questions on your specific project. Here is a list of all the different DEVOs. We are geographically assigned for the most part. So if you have a question in any of those counties, it's color-coded for who you should talk to. And I'll throw this information up at the very end of our presentation too, and can show you where to find it on our website. But that's who I'm talking about for your DEVO. And you'll also notice we have 2 open positions. So if you're interested, you can check out our website. Okay, so let's say you have figured out your project, you know your unit mix and your AMIs, and you're good with the gap funding amounts. You can submit an application for Division of Housing funds. And the way that Division of Housing then can help with the gap funding is either through federal or state funds to assist in that development. The final determination of a funding source is always usually determined during an application's review. So you might not necessarily know if you're applying for state or federal funds, and it's always a good idea to assume that your project is eligible for and will be applying for federal funds. And the reason for that is there are some application material requirements and procedures that you need to follow for federal funds. And so we want to make sure that all of those T's are being crossed and I's are being dotted. So just assume federal funds, follow all of those guidelines, and then as we do the underwriting, we can kind of figure out the best fit for a project. And then loans are awarded to for-profit applicants. And then if you are a nonprofit or local government, you're eligible for a grant for your project. And there are a couple of times when Division of Housing can consider a grant for a nonprofit and for-profit partnership. So if that's something that you're looking at, maybe you're a for-profit developer working with a nonprofit and you are partnered, here are some of the criteria that Division of Housing would consider before being able to award a grant. So the first one is that the for-profit is partnered with an unrelated nonprofit that has staff and an independent mission. And then also requires that the nonprofit partner who receives the DOH funds then loans the funds to the for-profit partner and or the property owner. And that the nonprofit partner must have right of first refusal upon the sale of real estate and or transfer of the ownership entity. Then there are a couple other criteria that must also be met. But again, every project is different and unique, so talk to your housing development specialist. But those are some of the things that we'll be thinking about as we underwrite and try to determine grant or loan. Okay. So another thing that you'll want to be aware of are the restrictions and the affordability requirements. So again, looping back to our mission, anything that Division of Housing put funds into, we want to make sure that it is sustainable and affordable in the long term. So a couple things that you'll be required to do on your end then. For rentals, you'll need to record a use covenant or regulatory agreement, and then submit the deed restriction that will be put on the property for a Division of Housing staff to review. There will also be an affordability period on any of those DOH funded units of 30 years. And if the project has federal funds that were already awarded that are less than 30 years, that total less than 30 years in their affordability period, then the DOH affordability term will extend the federal funds required term of affordability as necessary to total 30 years. And then finally, you're also agreeing to ongoing monitoring during the project and the period of affordability. So while it's under review during the contracting period, and then for that whole affordability period afterwards. And if you would like to do an affordability period of longer than 30 years, we definitely welcome that. And then for sale housing development, again, that affordability period is also 30 years. Okay, so let's say your project meets all these requirements. The next thing you'll want to do is talk to a DEVO. And you've probably already been doing this throughout the application process, but talk to us again. You'll be starting to work on your application materials and your neighborly application, which I'll show you how to do all of that in a moment. But just be sure that you're really working with your Devo, because we are trying to create all of the application portals in Neighborly for an application, so the applicant is no longer doing that. So please reach out and let us know when you're ready for us to start doing that. And the reason is if an applicant goes in and starts their Neighborly application and starts getting everything ready, and the Devo hasn't been talking to them about it yet, it's kind of a surprise. And we want to make sure no projects are getting lost, and that everyone is kind of on the same page about the pipeline and what's coming up, to make sure that your application process is streamlined and as smooth as possible. When you are submitting an application in Neighborly, which in the next slide I'll go through how to do that, here are some examples of documents that might be required with your application. So depending on if you are a new construction project or an acquisition project or a rehabilitation project, or maybe a mix of some of those, these are some things that you might need to submit. So you'll need an appraisal, especially for an acquisition. We'll need to see architectural drawings, audits and financial statements of the applicant, authorization to apply, a budget spreadsheet. So I'll show you how to go through that and how to fill that out too. Cost estimates, or a CNA, so a capital needs assessment. Environmental reporting, the depth of that reporting determines on the project as well. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth later on as well. You'll need a floodplain map, and then the GIN and proof of delivery. So that stands for General Information Notice. That kind of goes hand in hand with, you'll see kind of in the middle, relocation assistance plan and residential anti-displacement. So the reason for those is, especially let's say you're doing a rehabilitation project and you need tenants to leave their units for a week or so that you can maybe go in and put new stoves in, something like that, and do more of that rehab. You'll need to make sure that you have a plan in place for what that's going to look like for the tenants. And then the General Information Notice is really to follow the URA or the Uniform Relocation Act guidelines, which again, I'll talk about more later, to let people know that you are submitting for dollars for a project that might potentially displace people for a little bit. And it's really good to do that sooner than later. One, because it's a requirement for your application. And two, because it gives people a chance to know what's coming and start planning, rather than having something like that be a surprise. You'll also need to submit IRS determination letter if you're a 501c3, so that we can verify that you're eligible for a grant. And then letter of consistency with consolidated plan. This is for applicants submitting for CDBG applications in entitlement areas, to make sure that the application is consistent with those guidelines. So I'll show you where you can find a map of entitlement communities, but you'll want to keep that on your radar. And then letters of funding commitment, that would be, like I said, 75% of funds need to be committed before DOH can review the applications. That would be anything from a bank, any other grants or loans that are going into the project. Especially for new development, you'll need a market study. And then also match for home and state funds. So this would be, depending on the funding source, there are different levels of match that are required. Maybe that comes in the form of waived tap fees. Maybe that comes in the form of other grants. If you're receiving state funds, then the match has to be from a source that is not also a state fund. But if you're having a really hard time with that, talk to your Devo. There are cases where if you can show substantial evidence that that's not a possibility for your project, we can talk about what that looks like. You'll also need to submit photos of the project team resumes. That would be for every organization on your team. So GC, architect, consultant maybe, developer. And that really helps us showcase the project. When we go to State Housing Board, which is kind of the last stop of approval for a project, we can help show that whoever's on your team has experience and is able to do the project well. You'll also need to submit proof of publication. So when an application is being submitted to Division of Housing, you do need to notice that in the newspaper beforehand. So I'll talk through what that looks like again later on. Relocation assistance plan, we kind of touched on that, but definitely reach out to your Devo with any questions. Rent roll you'll need for rehab projects. You'll need site control, site plans, floor plans. Voluntary acquisition document, that is to show that if a project is being acquired, that no one is forcing the sale or purchase. And then I'll skip over here to zoning approval. We just want to make sure that zoning is consistent and conforming. And then the W-9 and org chart, these are two documents that are definitely needed and will also pop up after State Housing Board approval and before we can really get started on that contract. So you'll want to submit those And then I'll show you kind of a list too of what you need before the contracting period as well. So again, you might need to submit more than this. You might not need everything on this list, but these are some things to think about as you're developing your Neighborly application, because the sooner you have all of these and can submit to Neighborly, the faster the process with Division of Housing will go. Okay, so newspaper notice. This is required when you're submitting to DOH, and you will need to submit something in the local paper that you as the applicant are submitting for X amount of dollars for a certain project with the Division of Housing. And then if CDBG funds are utilized, which stands for Community Development Block Grant, this is a federal funding source that has a couple different requirements. So CDBG funds can only be allocated to a local government. And so because of that, they need to hold a public hearing to get approval for the public then to be able to submit an application. So that newspaper notice will look a little bit different because we need to see that the public hearing was held and noticed, and you'll need to submit that with your application. And there are a few other documents required with a CDBG specific fund. That's probably the only funding source that you'll submit an application to DOH knowing ahead of time that that's what you're going to want to apply for. Okay, so applications can be submitted on the 1st of every month. Again, this is for our regular GAP funding, not for any of those new funds yet. Maybe, we'll see. But I'm going to dip out of here really quickly and hop over to Neighborly to show you what that looks like. So hopefully I'm still sharing my screen. I can't see anyone still, but let me know.
You're good.
Okay, great. So I'm not sure what this looks like on the applicant end because as you can see, I'm on the administrative portal. But once a Devo creates an application for you in Neighborly, you'll get an email with information on how to log in and sign up and do all of that fun stuff. So you can sign in. And I'm using kind of a tester demo, so this is not a real application. But if I wanted to search for my project, I could go up here to the search bar and type in the case number, 31661, which you'll get in that email as well, showing that you've been added to the project. So here's the overall status page. This will have better information on your project that will not say name, delete, test. And then it will also show the status, probably a concept until you've submitted your application. And this is what your Devo can help fill out when you first tell them that you want to submit or you're getting ready to submit. And then when you're going through Neighborly yourself, you'll want to spend most of your time over here in this application part. So we'll go through this through section M, submit, and then kind of a precursor foreshadowing to section M. I'll try to be relatively brief here because I know it's a lot of information. But really for this first tab, what you're doing is you're going through and reading a lot of what I've already told you about in this webinar. But just make sure you're reading through that, understanding all of it, and then you can hit save. Kind of the same thing with the application overview. You'll probably know a lot of this already, but you'll want to go down, make sure you understand all of this and have read all of it, and click save. And then same for minimum application thresholds. This is a lot of, again, what we've already talked about, but make sure you're going through that. You've read it. You can click to electronically sign, date it, and then hit save. And then now you'll start filling in your information. So project information is that first one. This is all pretty straightforward. You'll need the name of the project, the location, the House and Senate district. If you're not sure what that is, you can go to this website linked here and type in, you can just type in really a city. It doesn't necessarily have to be an address. This is my example. And it'll show who the senator and representative are and the different districts. And then you can keep cruising down and fill in the information based on some of the drop-down menu options. Population served, if you're not sure, it's probably just family. And then again, you'll want to hit save. And it's really important as you're doing this that you're not hitting complete and continue. That will lock this section. And the only way to unlock it is for a Devo to go in and help you with that, which is really easy for us to do, and we don't mind. So if that does happen, it's not a big deal. But it will save you time if you don't have to reach out to us to go in and update that. Because if it's locked, you won't be able to go in and make any edits. And then next up, you have your applicant information. So this is all, again, pretty straightforward. And here's where you'll start uploading some of those materials that were required. And then you can hit save. Same over here with the project team, more information about who you're working with. And here is where you will upload all of those project team resumes and hit save. And then development information, here's where you can tell us about your project. This will get auto-populated into the document that we take to State Housing Board. So we can go in and edit it, but this is kind of like a high level, what do you really want us to know about the project? And then you can go in here and fill in all of that information. I'll talk more about visitable and accessible units later on in this presentation. And then you can also include any amenities that the application or the development has, and then upload more information about the site itself. So like architectural drawings, capital needs assessment, cost estimate, things like that. And then hit save. Next up is site information. So tell us about what's existing, if it's vacant or not. That will be really important, especially for those URA and relocation requirements. And then keep going down. Let us know when it was built so that we can figure out if there might be any risk of lead-based paint or asbestos. Keep going down. And then here you'll upload a little bit more about the site itself. So zoning, environmental report, floodplain, all of that, and hit save. Regulatory information. So this is consistency with the consolidated plan. If you need to figure out if you're in an entitlement community, you can click on the link there in Neighborly, and it will take you to a map of Colorado. You can search or zoom in a little bit more, but basically if you're on the Front Range, you'll want to pay attention to this. If you're on the Western Slope, unless you are Grand Junction, you should be good. And then more info down here, keep reading through all of that. Davis-Bacon will be big for CDBG if that's what you're applying for and receiving. So talk to your Devo for more info on that. And then more information uploaded here, click save. Community and local support is this next one. It's really important for staff to understand that the local community and the local municipality or county or whatever jurisdiction the project is in is supportive. And whether that's just through written documentation of their support or through financial support, all of that is really good info. And this is where you would upload that information and share how the community is being supportive. And we really just want to make sure that a project that's being developed will be welcomed by the community and will be able to stay long-term and be a good thing overall. So you can hit save. Project financing, this is the big one. I mean, it's all important, but this is really, really what we're looking at. So here is a link to a funding spreadsheet. I really recommend you don't use that one. And the reason for this is it's the same as the one you can find on our website, but quite a few updates are made to that spreadsheet pretty often, and they're always updated on the website. And sometimes we forget to update them here. So I really recommend doing the one on the website so that we don't send it back to you. And I'll show you where to find that. And here is where you can upload or include rows and information on your different sources. So for example, equity sources, you can add a row. You can say what type, maybe you're getting tax credits at 4%, the amount, and then if it's pending or committed, and if it's pending, when that committed date will be, because again, we're looking for 75% of funds. Permanent financing, you can add a row here and auto-populate loans, and there are different interest rates and terms of loans. And this might be a little bit redundant of what's in the spreadsheet, but it's super helpful for staff that all of this is filled out because it will also auto-populate into that summary that we then take to State Housing Board. So we want to make sure it's all accurate and good to go and uploaded here as well. And then here's where you will update and upload all of your letters of funding commitment, and then hit save. And this next one, required documents, this is a catch-all. So basically everything that you've already submitted in those previous sections can also be uploaded here if you want. You don't have to upload it twice. That's okay. You can do it wherever it makes the most sense for you. And then here is a list of additional requirements then for those CDBG funds. So there are 5 other things that need to be done, including that proof of publication for that public hearing. So that's where these would go. And you can also talk to a Devo if you have questions on what any of those mean. Then hit save. And then the next 3 sections are more just reading, signing, dating, saving, making sure you're understanding everything that you're reading. If you have questions, again, please don't just sign it. Feel free to reach out. Insurance requirements, this is really important, especially after State Housing Board approval and before you start that contracting. But the sooner that you start getting this underway, the better. So definitely make sure that you're reading through all of this and are good to go on that. To sign it, date it, and save it. And then same thing with statement of assurances. Make sure that you're understanding everything that you're reading, signing, dating, saving. And then you are ready to submit. So then you can certify that all the information is correct, sign it, put your title, and save it. If you are a for-profit nonprofit partnership and you're looking to receive grant funds, the nonprofit would need to be the official applicant. Same with CDBG. If you're a for-profit partnering with a local government for CDBG funds, the local government needs to be the applicant. And then you can do complete and submit here if you want. I'm going to just give you a little foreshadowing to section M, because these are a few additional application requirements that you'll need to fill out after State Housing Board and before we can get started on the contracting. So the sooner that you have some of this figured out and uploaded, the better, because that can just really help keep the ball rolling. So this is all just to make sure that all those contract materials are accurate and are showing what you want them to show. So this is pretty easy to start inputting, but here are some of those additional things like the W-9, the org chart that we talked about previously, signature block, anything like that needs to be uploaded here. That's where you'll do it. And then you can hit save. So that's kind of everything I have on Neighborly. If we have any specific questions on Neighborly, I can take those now. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep cruising through. I'll show you the spreadsheet and a few more things. And I don't hear anything, so I'm going to go back over here. Okay, budget spreadsheet. So this is the one that I said you'll find it in Neighborly. You don't want to use that one because we're not sure it's the most accurate and updated version. So I'm going to toggle back out and I'll show you where to find this on our website and then how to start filling it out. So you can go over to our Colorado, so cdola.colorado.gov. You can click on housing, and then you'll want to come over to Office of Housing Finance and Sustainability. This landing page, here's where you'll find that map of all the housing development specialists if you need their contact information. And then funding application, this is where you'll find more information on the application. So again, first of every month, you can submit for GAP funds. Development application instructions, I just want to point this out down here. This is what I'm presenting on. So everything that I'm talking about today will be in this document if you need a refresher or want to see something in writing again. But the budget spreadsheet, that is up here, and that is what you can download and start filling out for your project. So a few quick tips as you're doing this. Some of the tabs that you'll need to fill out might depend on whether or not you're doing rental or homeownership project. But regardless, you'll want to start out with some of those very straightforward things, project name, county, all of that information. And then you'll really want to make sure too that you're filling out square footage and number of units and square feet. And then you can go through and start inputting all the information here. So we talked about needing a cost estimate. That would be a third-party documentation showing the need and the cost of these different activities. And we'll be checking to make sure that what's listed there matches here. And then a couple other things to note too. There are a lot of formulas in this spreadsheet. So anything that you put here will be auto-populating later throughout the spreadsheet. So you just want to make sure as you're going through that everything is accurate and looks good and you're filling in all the tabs that the formulas are working correctly. And then on that note, there are a lot of formulas, so please don't change anything because it can make it kind of tricky to figure out where the error happened and trace it back. So you'll just want to fill all of this out. You might not have something to fill out for every single section. It really depends on the project. And then you will be filling out a developer fee. And just a note to you, if you're wanting to do a deferred developer fee, which we really do recommend and are looking for, a competitive deferred developer fee is about 20%. So keep that in mind when you're looking at that. Income and expenses, this is for rental units. So if you have a rental project, this is where we want to see the unit breakdown and the AMI levels. So for the type of unit, here's where you can autofill. Maybe you're doing 1 bed, 1 bath, and maybe you're doing a couple 2 bed, 1 bath. Income levels, area median income is that AMI. That's released every year by HUD, and then CHFA, Colorado Housing and Finance Authority, will then release it again, and it's broken down by county in Colorado. So that's kind of a more digestible version to read. But maybe you're doing these at 60% AMI and these at 80. And you can see what those limits are for 60 and 80% AMI. I think it goes from 30 all the way to 120 in those charts that are broken down by county. You can tell us the number of units and then the monthly rent. I'm just going to make this up arbitrarily because I have no idea, but we'll say $950. And this will auto-populate from the monthly rent and the number of units. And then you'll really want to make sure too that if tenants are paying utilities, that you consider that in the total monthly rent. So make sure that you're doing that math correctly so that you're not overcharging and exceeding those acceptable and approved AMI levels. And then you'll fill out all of your expenses here. You'll see that it's already auto-populating a few things from above down here. And then include any tenant paid utilities and what those might be. DOH financing, this is the next tab over. So this is where you'll include if you have a maybe a loan from a bank, and then what those different terms are going to be. You can say maybe this is tax exempt. Maybe it's $1 million loan. Oh, 100,000, probably not. But I'm just making this up. But you'll see over here, the debt coverage ratio will auto-calculate. And what we are looking for when we're underwriting is a debt coverage ratio, or DCR, of about 1.15. And that will all kind of figure itself out as you look at how much of a loan you're taking out, how much capital you have, how much cash you have, how all that is getting paid back. So you can keep filling that out. If you have any tax credits, those will go here. And then the DOH grant or loan, that's really dependent on your gap after you've figured out all your other loans and grants. Maybe you can throw in some waived fees, hopefully in here too. That would count as match. But when you're filling out how much you're penciling in the Division of Housing for, you'll want to loop back to those subsidy limits based on the rural and urban areas and make sure that you're not wildly exceeding those and that this is a realistic ask for Division of Housing. But again, always talk to your Devo about it. We can help you figure out the best number there. And then moving on to the pro forma, this is where you'll be inputting information, or a lot of it will auto-populate on your income, vacancy, net operating income, any debt services that you have that you need to pay, cash flow available. The debt coverage ratio should auto-populate here. And then it will take out any payments from the cash flow and then calculate your available cash after payments. So this is another thing that as we're underwriting, we're looking at this to figure out if you have a ton of available cash after payments, it's possible, even if you're a nonprofit, that we might consider a cash flow loan there. And that goes out through year 17 in this chart. So those are the basics on how to fill that out. If you have any more nuanced questions, definitely work with your Devo on that. We can help you figure that out. And then we will start going through a couple more requirements and things to be aware of as you're submitting an application. So definitely be aware of the Fair Housing Act and Section 504. There are additional trainings on both of these on our website that have been pre-recorded if you want to look at those. But Fair Housing Act is really important for a variety of reasons. But one of those is we want to make sure that if any deed restrictions might have Fair Housing Act violations, it might be a good idea to consult with a fair housing attorney to make sure that everything is good to go on that. Section 504 regulations, that is when I talked earlier in Neighborly about any visitable or accessible units. These are the requirements for what would need to be in that. And when we're calculating 5% of dwelling units or at least one unit, or 2% of dwelling units or at least one unit, we will be rounding up. So make sure you know that and understand what that means for your project. Environmental reporting. Again, this really determines or is determined on the activity for your project. This is a corn chart you can find on our website, and it's kind of supposed to be a fun way to show you that different types of activities might require different levels of environmental review. So something like new construction, which is listed at the top here, requires the most amount of environmental review and the biggest corn stalk. But be sure that you're thinking about this from the very beginning of your project, because some of these reviews can take a very long time. They need to be done by a third party, so Division of Housing will not do this for you. You need to submit that report as part of your application. And And I think from what I'm hearing, a lot of the consultants who do this or the third-party agencies that do this are pretty booked out. So definitely think about that in your timeline and talk to your Devo about what you need to do for your project. Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition, URA. This is what I was talking about earlier with the GIN, so General Information Notices, and then the Relocation Assistance. This is all kind of related to the same thing. So definitely make sure you watch the webinar that we've done on this. It's really good, very informative, and it'll help you kind of figure out what to do here. But really the main purpose of this one is to provide uniform, fair, and equitable treatment of persons whose property is acquired and who are displaced in connection with federally funded projects. And this really is a big one. So again, when you're applying, assume it'll be for federal funds and make sure that you're doing all of this properly. There are also building requirements. So if DOH is going to fund a housing project, it needs to comply with local building code requirements. And then based on maybe some of those funding sources, there might be a couple other things to think about. You can find all that information in our application instructions that I showed you earlier. Energy standards are another thing to consider. So based on single family and low rise or commercial and residential projects above 3 stories, this is what Division of Housing likes to see. These are kind of the recommended and encouraged energy standards, and they go in order of most to least, I guess, I don't know, encouraged. So that's what we would want to see in a project. If you can think about ways to incorporate that, that's always great. And then we also have elevator standards. So DOH encourages all multifamily, multi-story developments for seniors or persons with mobility impairment to provide 2 or more elevators. And then based on the number of stories and the number of units per floor, there are a couple standards there of how many elevators you should be including in your project. Also a really good thing to think about early on before you've done any of the design. That's kind of the overview on how to submit an application and what materials might be required. And I've showed you Neighborly. So like I said, make sure you have a Devo starting that for you. But if you have any questions on any of this, always feel free to reach out. You can find the application instructions on the website, and you can also find a ton of topics covered by previous webinars also on our website that can help get you started. And then again, we do have new funding, very exciting. So you can keep an eye on the website for NOFAs, or you can also sign up for our newsletter. We can send out a link on how to do that. And then keep us in the loop on any of your projects, and we'll help you figure out the best way to submit an application, whether it's through this or through that NOFA. So now we have time for questions. Again, these are your housing development specialists if you have specific questions, but if you have any questions on how to submit an application, we can take those now.
And I don't see any questions in the chat box. So like Olivia mentioned, if you have any questions, please reach out to your regional Devo. We're so thankful you all joined us here today. If there's no further questions at this time, we'll go ahead and end this webinar. Thank you so much, Olivia, for presenting today. And if you have any ideas on webinars you would like to see that would be helpful, please go ahead and reach out to our OHFS webinar series. I hope you guys all enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.